Everyone. Thank you for coming to our first author Zoom event. We're very excited to have that. We hope that it will be first in a series of programs that we'll be doing on Thursday evening, not just author events, but things like speakers and lectures and other things that might be of interest to our patrons on Thursday evening, perhaps on a monthly basis. So we're excited about that. So welcome to York Public Library. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Susan and I work with programs with our Assistant Director, Sophie Smith. And we're really excited to get this going and get this off the ground. We'll be recording tonight, so if any of your friends or anyone wasn't able to get in that you know, or you missed anything, you can search for it on YouTube at York Public Library or go to one of the links on the new website. So that won't be hard for you to find, and thank goodness we have that because apparently a few people are having difficulty. A note on book purchases, if you haven't been able to purchase either one of these books, there will be links in the chat, so you'll be able to do that, and we'll mention that again at the end of the evening in the Q&A. But on to the show and the point of this evening. It's my privilege to introduce these two folks, and Sandell and I had talked about this way before the pandemic started, when she was getting ready to start on her tour. So I'm glad we finally got to do this. So I'm going to introduce Sandell first. She's a local author, an award-winning essayist, a memoirist, and a mentor to many writers in the Seacoast area and the greater Maine and New Hampshire region. Her published works are in print in places like Sweeney's, Plowshares, and The Best American Essays. But her first full-length book, which is why we're here tonight, and I'm very proud to introduce her, is The Spiral Shell. A French village reveals its secret of Jewish resistance in World War II. Bravely published in April 2020, a memoir. So we're really proud to have her with us tonight. And I just want to use one quote from many of the wonderful reviews that it's received. A vivid present as well as a vividly imagined past. So I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion tonight with Annette Binder. Her first novel, The Vanishing Sky, was also published this year in the summer of 2020. It's based on her family's experiences and their life growing up in Germany before they emigrated to Colorado amidst the ashes of World War II. Annette, is a well-regarded fiction writer, and she's had many short stories published in the Southern Review, the Pushcart Prize Anthology, and the Penn O. Henry Prize, as well as many other publications. The Vanishing Sky is her debut novel, and it was nominated for an Indies Best Award. To me, that says a lot of people are talking about this book. So I think we should start a discussion and start talking about these two books tonight. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sandell and Annette. And thank you all for being patient as we start tonight. Sandell, Annette, welcome to the York Public Library.
Oh, thank you.
Sandell, are you with us?
I am with you, but I think I'm going to, well, the way we had it planned, Annette was going to actually, I thought, begin, but
Okay,
um,
whatever
but,
you like.
but I'm happy to say that I am so honored to be here tonight, and it's really quite an honor to have this happen in your hometown. So many times things happen outside of your hometown, but not inside of your hometown, and I am so grateful for this opportunity. I see so many familiar faces and familiar names, and it's just very, very heartwarming. So thank you to all who have come, and thank you to the York Public Library. And Annette and I had planned this as more or less of a spiral shell event or evening because this is my hometown. So I'm going to turn it over to Annette.
Oh, thank you, Sandell. It's such a pleasure to be part of this conversation about Sandell's just beautifully written memoir, deeply moving and beautifully written about French village and its secrets of Jewish resistance in World War II, and what it teaches us about courage and also about complicity. And I'm looking forward to the conversation this evening because I think there are just so many things to think about and to talk about that come up in this really beautiful book. So Sandell, I would say, why don't you just take it away from here?
Okay. So usually folks like to know, well, how did you come to write this book? How did you? Well, it was a very, very long journey that began in 2011 when I was awarded a residency at an artist retreat called Moulin à Nef in Auvillard, a village in southwest France. And the way I got there was through the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts that actually owns that retreat. And I have been a fellow at the VCCA for many, many years. And because I was going someplace totally different and into a whole new world, I wanted to know a little bit about the village. So I began to do some research on the village, and I found out it was on the pilgrimage route, one of the many pilgrimage routes that go through France and end up at the Shrine of St. James in Santiago del Compostela, Spain. And whenever I think about pilgrims, and maybe it's the Canterbury Tales that were drummed into me, I don't know, I think about crusades and crusaders. And when I think about crusades, I think about Jews and where were they and what were their lives like? And then I began to think about Jews and the Second World War. And I went to see a dear, dear friend who was a rabbi and began talking to him about the subject. And he said, well, if you're interested in that, I have somebody you need to meet. And that somebody was Valerie Ferret. And Valerie is French. She was living in Paris at the time. She was a Jewish historian and a journalist, and she spoke beautiful English. And we, because of the wonderful internet, we struck up a virtual friendship, and Valerie eventually became my translator. Another person that I contacted was Marilyn Callett, a poet who had been to Auvillard many, many times and written a bit about Jews during the Second World War in the village. But as a writer, we don't really like to step on one another's material. So I told Marilyn I was interested in the subject. Did you have any suggestions or thoughts for me? And she said, well, here's a name. Nobody's written about him. He's yours if you want him. So I took him. And his name was Jean Hirsch or Hirsch. He was a 9-year-old resistance courier during the war. And my maiden name is Hirsch. And so I was immediately drawn to him. And I was not on any sort of a quest for my own roots, but I did feel a connection with sharing a name. We also shared a bit of geography. His family came originally from the Alsace-Lorraine, and that is the region that my father's family came from. So I began researching Jean Hirsch, and I actually contacted him. He was in his late 70s at the time, we arranged to meet and he canceled, and we arranged to meet and he canceled. And finally, he told me he was out of town. So I knew that any meeting with Jean Hirsch was not going to happen. And so when I was in Paris visiting and chatting with Valerie, she said, I know how disappointed you were, so I have arranged for you to meet someone. And this person that she arranged for me to meet is named Jermaine Poliakoff. And she was 92 at the time. And she had been a caretaker in a secret house that protected Jewish refugee children during the war. And this particular house was for girls. And so if this book has a main character other than the narrator, it is Jermaine Poliakoff. She is a woman that I absolutely adored. And I think before I actually read to you, I'm going to show you some slides so that I can give you a sense of where in France I was. And I have a slide of the secret house and some others that I will share with you. And I'm going to share 4 slides, and then I'll come back and read briefly about Jermaine. So I'm going to share screen. Okay. And you should have a map of France in front of you. And so what I would like to show you is this red area mark right here is Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne, and you can see that it's quite far south of Paris. Paris is up here, and it's almost directly south of Paris. And I would say maybe a 4 or 5 hour drive, something like that. This was the site of the secret house, and this was an area, this was a village, and I did visit this village. It was a wonderful, wonderful place. And it seemed for some reason or another to be a place where Jews found safety. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then Auvillard became a place that was my home away from home. And so here is Bordeaux, and here is Toulouse. I would fly into Paris, and then I'd fly down to Toulouse, and someone would meet me, and we'd drive to Auvillard. And I would say Auvillard is about here, about halfway and a little south of those 2 cities. And this is the secret house in Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne. And I think, I visited, I think it was around 2012. And what interests me about this house is I had imagined a house in the country. I had not imagined this house. And this is one side, and it goes down this side street, and it's quite large. And so it's in a main square in Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne. And what you can't see is that in the foreground, there is a statue of the Virgin and Child. And down over here off your screen, there is a restaurant that was owned and operated by the Lequez family, a Catholic family who were resistors. They also owned this house. And this house, they knowingly and willingly rented it to the Jewish Scouts. And the Jewish Scouts were a normal scouting organization before the war, and they turned their huge organizational capacity to rescuing Jewish children during the war. And so there were secret houses and a web all throughout the south of France. And over here off the screen where you can't see, there is the huge Abbey of St. Peter. And I just imagined folks in the village passing by this house and going into the Abbey. I imagined the priest standing outside of his front door, and every one of them knew this was a Jewish house. And I find that absolutely fascinating. So this next slide is inside that house. This is Jermaine as a very young woman, and this is her friend Sultan. And Sultan and Jermaine were both caretakers called chieftains. Sultan was not her real name. And Jermaine had a nom de guerre as well, which was Maki. Only the director of the house knew the real names of these caretakers. And this fascinated me. This is a radio, and this is an antenna snaking up the wall. And this was illegal because they very secretly listened to the BBC. The next photo, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. The next photo is post-war. I don't know who the two people flanking Jermaine and this man are, but this is Jermaine post-war. This is Léon, and this man was her second husband. And he was a resistance worker during the war as well. And he became a very famous French historian who accompanied the French delegation to Nuremberg. Don't ask me how I fell into all these amazing people, but I did. And this is Jermaine a year ago. And this was our last visit. She was 100, it was October. She turned 101 in December, and she died the following, I'm gonna tear up. She died the following February. We have had a wonderful friendship, and she will remain with me always. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to read you just a little bit from my very first interview with Jermaine. I asked about a single day Jermaine remembered vividly. Jermaine folded her hands loosely in her lap and spoke of a day in 1944 when German soldiers were marching through Beauce-sur-Dordogne and heading to Normandy. They were nervous, edgy, and shooting wildly. Germaine rounded her hands and drew a dome in front of her belly, expecting my third child, carrying my baby in one arm, dragging Daniel by his hand, and running across a field to the woods. I heard a shot. I knew what it was. I wasn't frightened. I felt calm. I don't know why. Naturally, she was frightened, but fear propelled her and gave her strength. A pregnant woman carrying her baby, dragging her toddler, her heart pounding, her belly cramping, adrenaline pumping her legs. I looked into my cup of golden tea. How did she find her way through all that, then integrate into the person she had become? A few days before, Jermaine's granddaughter, a woman who became very religious and lived in Israel, had come to visit with her children, boys who wore payas, side curls. I wanted to make them lunch, Jermaine said. They came from so far. I offered a cup of tea. My granddaughter refused. She would not let the boys eat, not even a cookie. The woman was the daughter of the baby in Jermaine's belly. That day she raced for the woods. I knew they were Orthodox. Still, I was insulted. I don't like Orthodox. She meant orthodoxy. I agreed. Had I been visiting that day, I would have told that granddaughter to forget her rules of kashrut that allowed her to eat only kosher foods and from kosher plates and to drink only from kosher cups. I would have told her to take a cup of tea with her grandmother, to let Jermaine give cookies to the boys. Their great-grandmother had been to the edge and survived. To break bread, to share a meal with family and friends. This was nachas, a Yiddish word that, like most Yiddish words, squiggled out from under definition. Nachas was pleasure, but more than pleasure. Nachas was the pure joy a child brought to a parent or grandparent. Speaking English, Jermaine said, the more and more I get old, the more I can express what I feel. Only now I realize my life was not ordinary. At the door, Jermaine said, people tell me I was courageous to do what I did. I did not know. Perhaps courage is acting not out of bravery, but out of the essence of who you are.
You know, Sandell, I'm always struck by this part of the story and by her words, because I think so often people talk about courage as being what you do and not what you are. But I think there's a truth to this that is so interesting, that sometimes people just seem inherently courageous, and what they do comes from something inside them. And so when they say, I just do what I had to do, you know, what they had to do was immeasurably brave. What someone else might have done under the circumstances would be completely different. Was this something that struck you even in the moment or later in the writing? And how do you think it plays out more generally in the book? Because I think it's a fascinating concept.
Well, I think that, like with most of my insights when I'm writing, they come very quickly, and they're coming from someplace very, very deep, and I'm not sure where. And then thought begins to enter, and I think about other things, like remember the story about the person who jumped down into the subway to save someone. And I'm thinking that that's sort of an impulse.
Mm-hmm.
We all don't do that, or we all don't have that. And it doesn't have to be that dramatic. It can be the did I read you that part yet? Maybe I didn't read you that part, but I will read it to you if I haven't. There is, at the La Colony, there were folks in town who just came to that house, and they were in danger, but they came, and they knew, and they kept quiet, and one was a man who owned the hardware store in town, and he came to fix things that were broken. But perhaps one of the most interesting stories, and yes, Annette, the theme does go through the book. There was a gendarme in Bayeux-sur-Dordogne, and the gendarmes are not like our police. They're actually, the system is more military, because they can be from other places and come in and work in a village. And this man, Monsieur Duhaut, did not come from Bayeux-sur-Dordogne, but he was stationed there during the war. And what folks don't really realize is that the whole German organization had to be run like a corporation. It was not, oh, I'm going to arrest this person on the street. It was, okay, so we have room in our detention camps now, because we've already sent out the first group. So now we can fill our detention camps, and now we have the trains to move, and now we have the trucks. And now we can send our orders to the local gendarmerie, and they can do the roundups. And so the local gendarmeries all got notice before the roundups, and there were lists and there were names. And Monsieur Duhaut, when he got the list, would walk to La Colony, and he would knock on the door, and he would say, the Germans are coming, you must leave. And Madame Gordon, the director, packed up all these kids, and they were scouts, so they had their rucksacks already, and they would go to the woods, and they would camp, and they would break camp, and they would camp again. And in the book, there's a woman, Jermaine, and another woman that I interview, talk about these, and they call these the flying camps. So yes, what made him knock on the door? He was the only one who knocked on the door. You know, why in my beloved village of Auvillard did no one warn the families who were arrested there?
Mm-hmm.
So I do believe, Annette, that there is something inside of us, and I don't think we know if it's there.
Yeah. Until we're called to act in the moment, and then we find out one way or another, I suppose. Yeah.
I think, yeah. So, more on this subject, and I've told you about the square and everything that was in it. And when I visited the village, I had an interview in the morning with Monsieur Laheiche, who was the town historian. And I knew from Jermaine, she had arranged all of this for me. I knew a lot about the village, and I knew a lot about what they did. And I just really wanted to walk in her footsteps. And she told me about this restaurant across the way that the Lequez family owned. And they had a daughter who was in her 20s, probably around Jermaine's age, who cared for the youngest of the Jewish children above the restaurant. And she actually became one of the righteous among the nations. And so I had to eat in that restaurant. And there was, everyone went to that restaurant, including the milice officers. And the milice were like, they were a paramilitary organization, very much like the Gestapo, and they worked closely with the Gestapo. So you have Adrian's name, you have Monsieur Duhet and Monsieur Leheish. So I think you've got all the names. And this is going to be very, very brief, but it touches on another topic that Annette and I are going to talk about, which is memory and what happens to memory. So I am walking around in the evening on my way to this restaurant. I thought of my meeting with Monsieur Leheish, the two of us strolling to the river. Some people, he said, were very sympathetic, some not so much. Most people in France during the war were aware only of finding food. They didn't resist, they didn't cooperate. They waited for the war to stop. Inside Le Velouté, history breathed through these walls. Stories of Monsieur Duhaut, Madame Gordin, Monsieur and Madame Lacaze, Adrienne, and Jermaine. All of them must have come to this restaurant for a glass of wine, a smile, and a laugh. The place would have looked different then. No newly refinished floorboards with their shellacked, blonde, mirror-like surface. No freshly oiled dark beams, no stark white painted ceiling, no lime green walls with a single wall painted violet red. What had possessed the owners to paint such garish colors? Chances were that back when Jermaine was here, these walls would have been dingy, the floorboards dusty and marked with footprints. I pressed the soles of my sandals and made an imprint over imprints. If Jermaine's footprints were here, so too were those of the village doctor who had treated the children when they were ill, and of Zozo, not his real name, who had owned a hardware store and fixed what needed fixing inside La Colonie. A faucet, a broken pipe, a stopped up sink. If their imprints were here, so too were those of the milice officer who one evening chose to let a child live. Ordinary life, daily life, extraordinary decisions that meant survival.
Yeah, you know, I love this moment in the book, and I think what's so interesting about it, for me, as someone who's writing from the German perspective, based on my own background, is the focus on ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances and trying to show those people in their complexity. Because I think so often we look back on the past and everything seems very flat to us. So all the Germans were at the rallies because that's sort of the way we imagine them, and all the French were resisting sort of bravely. And, you know, you might have a couple of exceptional Germans being heroic, you know, the sort of Oskar Schindler sort of level of heroism. But what's missing is the reality for all the people who are in the middle, who weren't necessarily cooperating but weren't resisting either. And I think that's one thing your memoir does so beautifully, is it brings those people to life and shows us the sort of bravest among them, but it also shows us sort of the ordinary people and these small acts of courage. Some of these people will never know their names. You know, some of the people who saved others, who acted bravely on a small scale, but it brings those stories back to life, and it makes you realize how complicated it was in the moment at the time, and how we look back on it now and we sort of simplify all of these people and all of their stories. And so I think it's such a gift that you're able to breathe life into these stories and let us see some of the complexity that would otherwise be lost.
I think also, Annette, I need to thank you so much for saying that, but that is very much what struck me about your book. And Annette's novel is absolutely a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing. and a beautiful piece of work. And I think what's interesting is that I'm definitely writing from the Jewish point of view, and I'm definitely Jewish. And Annette was born in Germany and writes of her family, a novel based on an incident in her family. And I don't think, Annette, you've told us what actually sparked this. So I think I will say that Annette found after her dad died, she found a picture of him in a Hitler Youth uniform. And one of her characters, Georg, I believe, is modeled on her dad. And I would love to ask Annette if she would read from page 15 of her book, of where Georg, and it's very early in the book, and Georg is in the Hitler Youth, and he's not particularly happy.
That is very true. This is very early in the book, and thank you for your kind words, Sandell. This is very early in the book. The younger son in this family has been sent to a Hitler Youth Academy, and he really struggles with the expectations there. Who knew why they'd wanted him at the Hitler school? His eyes were brown and not blue. He was fat even before he came, and he'd gotten fatter still because the food was good. They fed their cadets fresh meat and thick slices of bread, and there was butter at the table and sometimes even chocolate. They taught no math and no languages at the academy, no painting or poetry, because they needed soldiers and not scholars. The instructors talked about the Slavs in class and how primitive their faces were, and how to use the Panzerfaust. They talked about the Jews and how they had to be rooted out from German soil, and nothing they said made sense. There weren't any Jews here, and not in his class back home either. He wasn't sure how long it had been since they'd gone away. Helga Weinstein, with her pale eyes, and the Stern brothers, who lived in the finest house in Heidenfeld and went to Würzburg every week to study violin. They'd stopped coming to school from one day to the next. They'd gone to their cousins in the hills, some people said. They'd gone to America, and Georg was jealous at the thought. He looked at the maps on the wall instead of listening to the lectures. He measured how far he was from home, how far from Mutti in his room. Not even 200 kilometers if you went straight, but Heidenfeld was as far away as the moon. Heidenfeld and the schoolhouse there and all the things he'd learned, all his Latin and his Greek.
Thank you. Thank you. So this young boy is really struggling, but he doesn't know why or how. And I felt that in this book, there was always this ominous feeling. And Annette somewhat reckons with that question, but she really doesn't touch on it a whole lot, because she's writing from the point of view of a family who kind of represses and is silent. And in Ovillard, there was also a huge suppression of memory and of what happened. I'm going to share screen once more and show you just a couple of slides of one slide of the village and introduce you to two people who were instrumental in my research. So here we go. We'll try this, and we'll go back to Jermaine. And this is one of the entrances to the village of Ovillard. And this is the clock tower. And in the Middle Ages, this village was gated, and one of the gates was at this entrance. And this is, so on a July morning in 1942, gendarmes from the gendarmerie that was up on the hill came through this archway at the clock tower. And of the 4 families that were arrested in Ovillard, one of them lived in this house, and they were taken. And they were Bruno and Gisela Kurzweil and their 17-year-old daughter, Adele. And I do tell her story in the book. These two men are Robert Lasson and Gerhard Schneider. Gerhard was born in Germany in 1941, and he actually knew Seisemann Hersch, John Hersch's father. And he was very, very interested in Jewish history in Auvillard, and he was interested in the subject well before that, because being a German, he felt that he needed to come to terms with that history. He retired in Auvillard. He is married to a French woman who was an academic, and she was the one who grew up in this area, and that is why they ended up retiring here. And he started a French and German cultural society to try to bridge the gap between their two cultures. And so bridging gaps and building bridges was very much something he wanted to do. And this is Robert. And Robert came to work in the nuclear power plant. He's a nuclear engineer nearby. And from the village of Auvillard, you see those smokestacks. And he is a reader and someone interested in history. And I was introduced to him, and someone said, you should interview him, you should talk to him. His father was a gendarme during the war. Well, that was wrong. His father was not a gendarme during the war. His father was on the Maginot Line during the war, captured and imprisoned in Germany and escaped. His father became a gendarme after the war. And Robert said to me, this is important to me that my father became a gendarme after the war. And I said, yeah, that's important to me too. So they are on the grounds of a chateau that is part of the village of Auvillard, but sort of out and off. And this is where the Gestapo arrested Bertha and Seisemann Hersch, Jean Hersch's parents. And I'm going to read just, I stopped screen sharing, and let's see, I'm trying to stop screen sharing. No, I hit the wrong button. Now I have stopped screen sharing. A little bit about memory and what happened to memory after the war. Doing okay for time here. We'll have to sort of, this is a very short reading. Robert told me his father used to fish the Loire, the river that flowed through Nevers, the medieval town where his family lived until he was 8. During the war, the Germans occupied Nevers, and the Allies bombed it heavily. For years, these Allied bombings of French cities and French civilians were an untold story. The French knew, of course, but not us. I doubt many Americans now know the extent of those bombings, even today. Robert's parents had lived through sirens, bombs, explosions, cries for help. They'd foraged for food. Everyone had. What of the Jews? What did his parents know of the Jews? What did they see? Personne ne parle pas, Robert said. No one says. Afterward, they protected us by their silence. I have no memory of the Shoah. Later, I learned. After the war, truth went underground, buried by what became known as the French silence, de Gaulle claiming that all of France had been resistant, a myth that traveled across the sea to the States. At home, we put forth our own wartime myth, our government telling us we'd done all we could to help the Jews. We hadn't. No memory and no one making memory. Robert and his ex-wife had brought their children up inside both the larger silence and the personal silence. Telling your children about collaboration, defeat, and your family's humiliation was not a narrative you wanted to pass on. Yet in graduate school, when Robert's son Nicholas wrote his master's thesis, he chose as his subject the liberation of the camps. He visited Auschwitz, Robert said. For years, I did not know this about my son. Why? I did not know this. Truth, like water, seeps through invisible cracks. So I'm thinking we're getting on in time, and I think Annette and I would both love to answer questions, and we certainly hope that you have them. And we're both very interested in these themes of silence and of memory and what happens to memory and what happens to silence. So I don't know how we can throw this out to everyone, but we'd love to hear from you. Sophie?
Sorry, my video disappeared on me. Everybody is presently muted, so one option is that you can put a comment into the chat and I can relay any questions that may come up. Or we can really go for it and I'll just unmute everyone and we'll have a free-for-all. I think that's the question at the moment. But
well, we can see how the free-for-all goes.
All right, is everyone ready? So I will unmute everybody, and if those of you who have been through Zoom calls before realize that if you start talking on top of someone, it gets all confused, but hopefully we'll be able to all work together and ask some wonderful questions.
Is it possible for anybody to just raise a finger or something? Can you see everybody, Sophie?
I can see many people, but not everyone, so. Let's see, I think everyone's unmuted right now. You can certainly mute yourself back if you would prefer not to be vocally involved right now, but I'll turn it over.
I have a question for Sander. Hi.
Hi.
I did write you, I was very impressed with your book, and I did write a note to your publisher that was on your website. I don't know if you ever received it. I never received a note back, but I'd love to hear more about where your journey led you to. You mentioned that it led you back to religion. It led you back to having a bat mitzvah. So could you just speak a little bit more about that?
Sure, Barbara, and I did not receive your note. I'm sorry. If you go to my website, there's a way to contact me through my website.
I did do that.
Then I don't know. I should have gotten your email directly.
Yeah, that was back in July, and it was particularly poignant at the time because I just turned 80 this year and was having my B'nai mitzvah, bat mitzvah at that time. So just speak about your journey.
Okay, and contact me.
I also have roots in York Village, but we won't get into that at this time.
Okay. So what happened was that I grew up very, very assimilated, and I grew up with a really a kind of deep shame about being Jewish, and I really could pass. And so I chose a lot of the time to pass within a Christian community, not among other Jews, not among my family, but a lot of the time I didn't have to say I was Jewish, and I didn't. And so that kind of thing was a problem that I had for a good part of my life. And I began a journey back to Judaism very, very slowly. And at first it was really a scholarly journey back, in which I learned more about the philosophy, and I learned about the scholars, and I studied about biblical women in the Bible, and I would go down to Hebrew College in Brookline, Massachusetts, and take courses. And when I went back to school to get a Master of Arts in Liberal Studies at Dartmouth, of all places, is where I began studying with a Jewish professor and scholar, and really began the journey then. And so what I discovered is that the French Jews, and particularly Jermaine, were very, very assimilated. And they did not speak at all about being Jewish. And before the war, Jermaine was engaged to a Catholic man. And in her family, there were a lot of people who had converted. And she had sisters who were Catholic. And I think she had one brother, and I think he converted as well. And during the war, her father was a linguist. He spoke 10 languages, and he was in Paris, and he was on his way to register for the Jewish census. And he said to himself, oh, this is not such a good idea. And so he spoke fluent Spanish. He went into a Spanish church. He talked the priest into giving him false baptismal certificates for his whole family. He went through the war as posing as a Catholic, which had its own consequences for him, which you find out if you read the book. And so all of that, Barbara, made me think about what was I doing. And I can give you a little tiny example. Now, I will post Jewish stuff on Facebook and whatever. I would not do that before. I didn't want my Jewish identity out there. And I feel so much freer. And I think I've become a much better writer because of it. I think it was holding me back as a writer.
It was your deep, dark secret, it sounds like.
It wasn't really, because people knew. I never really hid it. But it was something inside of me that had to come out to free something so that I could really write from my heart.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Where did you grow up, my dad?
Well, my dad was kind of a mavericky kind of person, you might guess. And so we moved around a lot when I was a kid, but I would say for the most part, New Jersey.
Very good. Thank you for sharing. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hi, Sandell. It's Alan. How are you today?
Hi, Alan. Hi.
Hi. Last year, Heidi and I were traveling a bit through Europe, and we spent some time in Berlin, and obviously visited the Holocaust Memorial there and the museum. And what was very apparent, even though Germany is going through, in a contemporary sense, some very difficult times regarding attitudes about Jews by some of the rightist group, it was part of the public education for Germans after the war to learn about the Holocaust and to understand it. What happened in France? Why was it in some ways such a different experience relative to the French versus the Germans' reaction to in the end to the Holocaust in terms of more contemporary post-World War times? Why were the French so unlikely to, in a sense, discuss this until fairly recently? I think it was the Prime Minister recently, he has apologized for the acts of the French. But can you talk a little bit about
Alan,
this?
The short answer is because they're French, but that's
exactly.
but there are lots of reasons. Gerhard actually said to me when we were first interviewing, he said, the French are not where we were in 1945, 46, 47, 48. So the French have a tremendous pride. I think the German pride, the Germans were so complicit. I mean, there's nothing they could hide. They were, they made this war. They made this war. They made the concentration camps. They made the gas chambers. They made the SS. They made it all. And they couldn't hide it at all. So, but the French could.
Yeah.
And they did.
Thank you.
And also, so many of the French, in at least when the Allies marched in and to Germany, and they took over, and they punished people who were collaborators. You couldn't do certain things if you did certain things during the war, but none of that existed in France. In fact, those who many high officials who collaborated ended up in very high government positions. So what choice do you have but to hide it? And, you know, I think that what interests me also, and probably Annette too, is this whole idea of truth and this whole idea of propaganda, and how do you sort the truth, and how do some people buy into that propaganda and some people not buy into that propaganda. And that says something very interesting to me about the radio, what was on the radio in Germany. In France, people could somehow listen to some of the BBC, BBC. And also in France, there were the drops of resistors coming in, but none of that in Germany. You want to talk a little bit about that, Annette?
Yeah, you know, it's a really interesting question. I mean, I think silence is something that Germans also grappled with, often on an individual level, if not on a collective level. And so, you know, my father never spoke once about his childhood in Germany. I had no idea he'd been in the Hitler Youth and had run away from his post until long after he passed away. And I know from other Germans of my generation whose parents or grandparents were of age during the war, that was not something that was talked about inside the house. I mean, that silence pervaded everything. You know, and even in Germany, that one of the main proponents of the murder, the systematic murder of the mentally ill, he managed to get out of jail, change his name, and become an expert witness, and lived a long life with it being an open secret of who he was. So even in Germany, I think that it's more complicated. I mean, clearly the country as a whole has grappled with its guilt and made efforts to memorialize the victims and, you know, sort of document the horror of what they did. But on an individual level, I think the silence pervaded an entire generation and trickled down to the later generations in very unpredictable ways. So I think the idea of silence is just really, it's just fascinating to me. And denial. You know, some people, even in the moment in Germany during the war, were in denial. Like their mind was able to rationalize away what their heart knew was true. And so I think that's just a really interesting and terrible dilemma, and something that, you know, no doubt happened in France too, Sandell, with people who were complicit and or failed to resist. And so, you know, that family was taken away. And, you know, the people who failed to help them had to live with their failure. You know, if they had the moral clarity to see what was going to happen and know that it was wrong and failed to act on it, that's something you have to live with. And I think that's a really, I mean, it makes for, it's a tragedy, but it makes for compelling stories, and coming to terms with that. Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much for a wonderful collaboration. The two of you have been great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question. Hello?
Hello?
Yes, I have a question. The Frenchmen in the village during the war who helped the Jewish kids, were they aware of each other?
I'm sorry, there was an echo. Could you say that again for me one more time?
Sure. The ordinary folks in the village who helped the Jewish kids, like you said, the doctor and the repairman in the village, were they aware of each other helping? Were they aware that they were helping Jewish kids?
Oh yeah, they knew they were. They knew that they were helping Jewish kids. They knew they were helping a Jewish organization. And they also knew that that was a place where resistance workers came and where they picked up maybe children, they distributed false documents, because all of the children in that house eventually had to be taken to safety, and they needed people to transport them, and they needed documents. And when certain girls' names appeared on the list, they had to be removed from the house and taken to someplace that was safe. It was so fascinating, wasn't it? The way they worked whole network without
And
cell phones.
and they had to somehow hide themselves from collaborators. They had
Right.
to be
Well, that
aware
was
of collaborators.
you
as
see,
well.
that was the thing that where Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne, the village where the house was, and my little beloved village of Auvillard differed. There did not seem to be collaborators in Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne. There did not seem, and I have no idea why. The Germans were not bivouacked in either village. They were bivouacked nearby. And so they would come to the villages to do, for their missions, for whatever they were going to do. They came to Beaulieu-sur-Dordogne also because it was such a beautiful place and they liked to visit. So Jermaine tells this amazing story of walking on the street one day. I think it was after the house closed, and she was holding the hand of Daniel, her son, who was blonde-haired and blue-eyed. And she passed two German soldiers on the sidewalk, and they walked by and they said to each other, "Oh, they make such beautiful little Aryans here in France, don't they?"
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question for you both. We've been using the word collaborate and collaboration a lot tonight. And I recently read an article, and it was referring to someone working in the National Archives in France, in Paris. I know that's not where you did your research, either of you, but they said they mentioned that the word collaborate was like a dirty word in France, that in business and things like that, it's such a buzzword now everywhere, you know, in business in the United States, but that in France, you didn't use that. It wasn't part of the lexicon because it had such a bad overtone. Did you find that when in any of your research in Germany or France that, you know, it didn't have the same positive connotation that we talk about now? Oh, we have to collaborate with each other to get things done, but they didn't like using it at all.
No, they wouldn't, because that word was in the agreement. Somebody is sort of giving feedback. I don't know if
It's when there's a lot of mics open.
Oh, okay. So that word was in the agreement between Marshal Pétain, who became the ruler of France under Germany. He was a World War I hero, and interestingly, he won his fame by defeating Germany in World War I. But he was the one who signed the armistice with Hitler. And I wish I could remember, Susan, I can't remember offhand how that particular word collaboration was used, but it became associated with Pétain doing Hitler's bidding, because that is what he did. He had Nazi sympathizings, and he carried out basically the Nazis' orders. He was very, very, very much in favor of the Nazi slogans. He believed in the church. He believed in the family, and he was the chief collaborator. So it is not a word to use in France. And then it also became the word of anyone who turned someone in. And that was the thing about Auvillard, that there were people who turned people in Auvillard.
So I just wanted to clarify that, you know, that
Yeah,
wasn't.
it's not a word you would use in France.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, okay.
How about Germany, Annette?
I think it has a different implication in France, you know, from Germany. So I'm not familiar with that sort of resonance for the word in Germany. You know, I think, you know, Germany has other issues in terms of the kids and the grandkids of people who were of age during the war. But I don't think the word collaboration has the same negative connotation. You know, Sandell, I actually have a question that I've never talked about with you before, but I think is so interesting. You do three things. You've got sort of three threads in your book. You've got sort of your investigative thread, which is sort of your, you know, nonfiction thread. And you've got this wonderful thread where you sort of imagine what it might have been like back in the moment, where you take us back and sort of imagine what the actual scenes were like. And then you've got the thread of your own personal journey, and you interweave them really beautifully. And I'm wondering, of those threads, was there one that was much more challenging for you to write? I know you have a background in fiction, so I'm imagining the imaginary thread probably came very naturally to you. But I wonder, was there one that was more challenging as you sort of wove them all together?
The personal journey was the most challenging, absolutely. The investigative, I kind of fell down into that. I was like playing. I didn't know what I was doing. I think if I had set out to do this particular book and do this particular thing, I would not have gotten anywhere. It would have been too big. I wouldn't have seen how I could possibly tackle it or handle it. But I didn't set out to write this book. I set out to write essays, small things about the people I was finding and interviewing. And so, and I always say, you know, I was in my 70s when I started, and I say it was like, it was the stuff I didn't do in my 20s, because I was married and raising kids in my 20s. And so, so I really was having a great deal of fun traveling all over the place. And I rented a car and I drove to Buyus or Dordogne, and you know, there I was at my son's suggestion, like, oh, you should drive off the road and just go someplace and explore something. And I said, oh yeah, that's a great idea. So that's what I did. And I had a ball with that. And I'm always wanting to know more. And of course, Jermaine's husband was an historian, and he did go to all of the archives. And I had, there were a couple of his books in translation that I did read. So I enjoyed all that reading. And you're right, I loved the driving down into the imaginative, which is basically writing fiction. And I was taken to task for that by one interviewer, not an interviewer, reviewer, about too much diving down into the imagination. But I liked that, and the personal journey was the most difficult.
Interesting.
If anyone else has any other questions, I'm sure we have a few more moments where we could entertain them. But I also want to mention again that the links to both Sandell and Annette's websites are in the chat. So if you would be interested in purchasing either of their works, they're waiting for you. And I will also have the recording of this video as well as that information on the library's website within a day or two for your reference.
And I also wanted to mention Sandell is doing a giveaway where we're all keeping track of who's asking questions, and then one lucky questioner will get a signed copy of her book. So fun.
So ask a question before we sign off.
Good chance.
Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you all so much for coming, for staying with it.
Thank you.
Can't thank you enough. And thank you, Annette.
Thank you both. Thank you both. And thank everyone for coming to our first virtual Zoom. So we really appreciate it at the library. Come again.
Thanks, Sandell.
Thank you.
Very, very much. Very wonderful evening. Thank you.